I do that again and kick off partway through a sentence. Okay, so using seabirds as indicators of marine ecosystems is hard work. It's quite challenging. We can't simply use easily captured parameters like population size or even breeding success, because seabirds in general have the ability to offset changes in environmental conditions to ensure that themselves and their offspring are well provisioned. Seabirds are intelligent and adaptable, and understandably do things like switch prey types or increase the amount of time that they spend looking for food, or perhaps feeding more frequently. So this means that the important signals that managers need for mitigation strategies are masked, and therefore crucial timescales for actions for protection could be missed. Dealing with this is something that scientists have been attempting to get a hold of for a fair amount of time. Now, you might remember in one of our earlier sessions, we reviewed a paper here by Brian Dunphy, who was sort of looking at this to some extent using common diving petrels. There have also been a few papers to come out of the California current ecosystem by folks at Point Blue Conservation, NOAA, and UC Santa Cruz. And it's my understanding that to some extent these techniques have kind of been applied there for management to some degree, particularly in regards to the sardine and anchovy issue. So in this particular paper, which is led by Catherine Cavallo, I'm sorry, Catherine, if I mispronouncing your last name. I'm terrible at pronouncing things. So
no, that's good.
Oh, is it Catherine Cavallo? Okay, I didn't want to assume that it had some funny pronunciation.
In Australia, we're lazy and we just say Cavallo, but the Italian would be Cavallo.
All right. Okay. Good. The authors here approach this problem by studying records of foraging success and foraging effort in order to calculate a measure of foraging efficiency that is analogous to the catch per unit effort often used by fisheries for stock assessments. In past work, catch rates have been determined by recording the foraging success through measures of things like total mass ingested, so how much stuff is being eaten, or through other proxies like the number of prey capture attempts, and that can be measured by things like stomach temperature pills in albatross. They take those metrics and divide them by the total foraging time. However, these studies often lack information on specific diet types, and so any inferences that were made were kind of limited to how much stuff was out there, rather than what kind of stuff and the abundance of those specific prey items. So the authors in this case chose to work with little blue penguins, not just because they're really cute or perhaps somewhat more accessible than some other species, but because evidence suggests that there's basically no individual specialization on prey types, meaning it's a little easier to generalize signals across the entire population. There's also been a fair amount of work showing that little blue penguins consume prey types relative to the general abundance of those prey types in foraging zones, as measured by, say, fisheries data. So this particularly lovable penguin makes for a great study system to improve on past catch per unit effort estimates using seabirds, which was the specific goal of this research. The authors were fortunate enough to be able to work at the Phillip Island colony in southeastern Australia. And for those of you not familiar with Phillip Island, I imagine most of you are, because there's a number of Australian and Kiwis who are kind of hang out on this session. But if you're not familiar with it, I suggest you have a quick search on the internet, as it's totally a fascinating place with a really, really cool story. So there were 2 sites on the island that were used. The authors randomly selected 100 nests from these 2 sites. Birds were fitted with pit tags, which are basically subcutaneous little microchips, you might want to call them, for those conspiracy theorists out there who are worried that we're all going to get microchipped one day. These pit tags are used for individual identification. So basically the birds walk through a little scanner and they walk onto a weighing platform before sort of trundling off to their nests, which means that you can calculate your total trip duration because you know when the bird left and came back. You can also calculate the body mass before and after it came back, so you know how big they were, so how much mass they gained while they were at sea. The others next went through the colonies and then gathered up poop samples from individuals with eggs or chicks. And then applying some fancy PCR amplification techniques, they were able to elucidate the broad proportional diet composition, so how much stuff was in the poop. The standard catch per unit effort calculation at this point is relatively straightforward. So you can take the change in body mass and divide it by the foraging trip duration, and that gives you sort of the base CPUE. To calculate the species-specific CPUE, the body mass can be multiplied by the proportion of prey types found in DNA samples. In this case, the focus was sardines and fish, so you just multiply by that proportion to get your final catch per unit effort for that, the species-specific catch per unit effort. Once this was done, it was possible to calculate total biomass consumed by the birds by simply multiplying the breeding population by the approximate number of days spent foraging at sea by an individual bird, and then you multiply that by CPUE. That gives you a total biomass consumed by the colony. So there were 7 taxonomic groups identified in the penguin's diet, with fish making up an average of about 62 to 64% of the diet. Out of the fish, 11 fish identified, 11 species accounted for greater than or equal to 2% of the data. So from September to December 2015, so that sort of summer 2015, early summer 2015, 70 to 80%, 86% of the diet was sardines. However, in the following year, in September and October, red cod accounted for between 54 and 79% of the diet. So there's quite a significant switch. In December 2016 and January 2017, barracuda accounted for 60 to 66% of the diet. And actually, that's quite an interesting finding for me. I didn't realize they actually ate barracuda. I assume they're small barracuda, but that's quite cool. Individual foraging success was highly variable, while foraging effort was comparatively consistent. However, catch per unit effort seemed to be relatively constant in the first year of the study, with more variability in the second, particularly when the birds were foraging on barracuda. A conditional inference tree was used to look sort of at the mechanisms of what's driving CPUE, and the inference tree suggested that the driving factor for determining that was the month parameter. Probably not surprising if over time you're looking at shifting prey bases over the course of a season. The authors estimated that the colony consumed about 618 tons of fish in year 1 and 682 tons in year 2, which is that seemed like such a huge estimate. I realized that there are a lot of birds at this colony, but that is a lot of fish. When you break that down by species, in year 1, that's 219 tons of sardines that were extracted and only 7.7 tons of red cod. However, in year 2, that switches to 215 tons of red cod and 38 tons of sardine. So that's quite fascinating. It's hard to believe that penguins can eat that much, but I gotta say that's super cool. So I have a few questions for you, and thanks very much for this paper. It was a really nice read. I do appreciate the fact that you guys have a very lovely plain language summary that's available online, and that I appreciate when those get included, because it makes my life a little bit easier. I can read that first, and then it makes me tune in to what kind of language I need to be focused on in the paper. So that's quite cool. So my first question for you regards activity at sea, and whether or not you do mention in the discussion that there could be minor information loss on the longer trips. And what I'm wondering is, how much are they pooping while they're at sea? Are they losing a significant amount of mass when they go out, that your initial estimate of body mass could be overestimated?
Yeah, so we looked for different evidence from some kind of in-lab studies where they'd fed penguins a whole lot and waited for them to poo it out and stuff. And in those first days, there really wasn't like that.
Oh, we've lost.
Day. I think the issue happens maybe. Oops.
Sorry,
I'm talking too fast.
You froze up there for a second.
Yeah, I'm on Australia's internet, so it's not wonderful. The short story is there is some loss, and the loss will get bigger as you have more days at sea. And so that's kind of an issue if you're having birds that are spending a long time at sea. But in the years we studied, the food was so good that they really didn't spend that long at sea. And so I guess that's where this method can be quite useful, is in those years where the food availability is really quite high, we assume, because when it's really low, you can use demographic things to kind of track prey availability. But this one works really well in those years where, yeah, they're doing quite well.
And if I can add to this, in the initial Cormorant paper you quote, we spent quite a lot of time working on correction factors precisely for this, for the amount which gets ejected by the birds at sea before they are weighed again on the weighing platform. And at least in the case of great cormorants, the correction was always a very small amount of the total mass brought back to the nest. So if I remember well, we were applying that correction factor, but it was really the matter of a few percent.
All right.
Thanks,
Very cool. All right. So the other next question I had for you was about, actually, and what I'll do is I'll share my screen because it helps to illustrate my question. Hang on a second. Let's go. Which screen do I want to share? No, this screen is the one I want to share. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Okay, if you guys can see this, this is the wrong one, of course. It's, hang on a second. There we go. No, that's not the one. Oh, goodness. Here we go. That's what I'm looking for. All right. I just wanted to point out this figure here and just discuss this interesting little pattern that you're seeing here. So obviously in the first year, according to your low S curves anyways, you're seeing that it seems relatively stable through year one. And I assume that's probably related to the fact that they're foraging on sardines, and that curve seems to be down here, seems quite broad. Whereas in year two, you've got this almost like a spike of red cod abundance in the diet early on, and then not a whole lot of anything. You get this sort of barracuda foraging here late in the season. So is that sort of what's going on up here with this kind of variability in the catch per unit effort, or is there something else you reckon?
I think that's mainly it. I don't know if Andre and Richard wanted to say anything there. I mean, I think it's mainly, they obviously, with the other species being so low, because in that first year, even though they are mainly foraging on red cod towards the end there, the other species aren't that low in terms of CPUE in the diet. Mm-hmm. But in the second year, all those other species are almost on the zero line. So yeah. I suspect it's just that there were peaks and troughs in what was available.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you're saying that they're eating barracuda here, is this like I assume these are, now I hope I'm thinking of the right species, but barracuda to me are like monster predatory tropical fish. So are these like baby barracuda they're eating?
No, they do get, yeah, they're baby ones that they're eating. And actually a lot of the prey, except for the real small pelagics like sardine and when they eat anchovy and stuff, most of those prey items, including red cod, which grow very quickly, mm-hmm. they're all really small. I think they eat anything about up to 12 centimeters. Yeah. But they'll put anything in their mouth smaller than that.
Yeah. Okay.
And actually we do also recover things that we would consider reef fish. And we think that most of the time those are fry in the water column as well, or not fry, but juveniles in the water column, rather than feeding on a reef.
All right, yeah. I think you mentioned at some point too, there's something like, you say there's something like 75 or 82 species or something that were detected. Was that mm-hmm. right? That is a
huge number.
Right, yeah, that's quite amazing. I mean, it kind of shows that these guys are obviously very generalist, very generalist in their foraging. They're kind of eating whatever they can find. So does this...
Can I say something, Grant?
Yeah, go for it, Andre.
Good. Can you put back on that graph that you were talking about before?
Yeah.
So as you can see my cursor, I'm joking, you can't see it. On the A, you see that the main diet there was sighting. Mm-hmm. sardine is, well, we think is the preferred prey for penguins because an adult sardine is about 12 to 14 centimeters long, which is still sort of a penguin bite size. And as Kathy said, all the other ones, they grow really fast. So every other species in the first year, they become bigger than penguins. So they're eating those species in a very short window of time. So, and I think that the second, the letter D reflects that because, so then the sepia, they have to chase for different things there in the second year. And that's why you have that variability because it's a different peaks of different species. And as in A, you have a predominance of sardine much longer in a time scale.
Yeah. And I guess following up on that a little bit, it's quite interesting that there doesn't seem to be as much sardine in the second year. Is the sardine, this sardine sort of ecology in this region driven by environmental change similar to, say, the Eastern Pacific? Is there a similar cyclic pattern between them and other species?
They are just like, well, they're the same species. You have the what's it called, boost and
Boom and bust.
Boom and bust. Yeah.
Sorry, English is my third language. Yes, so then some years they're fantastic, and some years they just disappear.
Right.
And which is interesting because it's such an important prey for penguins, but we cannot put a regulation on that in terms of fishery because it's so unpredictable. So it's really hard to put a cap there because some years are fantastic and can fish lots, and some years they're disasters. So it's the challenge for management.
Oh, very cool. All right. David, I'll hand it over to you if you have some questions.
Oh, yes. Well, I have comments mainly. Well, congratulations on the paper. A very nice piece of work and very thorough in the analysis. So that was nice. No, it made me think that now the challenge is of course to convince fisheries people that we can use that type of quantitative evidence gathered by seabirds. So I think this really calls for a kind of a cultural shift because we, as seabird ecologists, we always have to excuse ourselves when we're going into this sort of analysis. And then, as you state in the discussion, you say we recommend independent prey sampling. I think that at some stage we'll have to gain confidence and say, well, this is what we get out with the most advanced techniques we have. And we actually do not need independent prey sampling because I've been digging a lot into the fisheries biology literature over the last years. And even for managed stocks, sometimes the metrics people use are very, very crude. But of course, they'll never admit to it. And I don't know if this applies to your study system, but very, very often, I think you can come forward with metrics measured by seabirds and say, well, this is the index we'll be using in management. So I'm calling actually for more self-confidence with this type of results. And as Grant mentioned, at least in the California current, some of these metrics are being used for management, and also in the English Channel on the French side, where we work on northern gannets. There is an index which is foraging effort. So it's by far not as advanced as what you propose, but the foraging effort, the effort the birds are making to gather their food, that's a metric which is being used by management to have an idea of resources, especially mackerel, available in the English Channel year after year. So I think we should really push to turn things on their head and say, we have now very advanced methodology to measure catch per unit effort in seabirds, and that is an index. So again, compared to some of the stuff people are using in fisheries biology. It's very advanced. So congratulations on that. But along the same lines, my question was more if you want to use this type of metric in a long-term perspective and for management, is it practicable at your study site? So the sort of work you've been doing over a few years, do you think it's really workable in the long term?
Do you want me to answer that, Andre, or you got it, Richard?
Maybe if I can just say something. Thanks very much for the comments, David. One of the things that's really interesting about the results from this study and then the other work that Andre and I have been doing together at Phillip Island, and Jan and Akiko the same, and many people with bird tracking and dietary studies, is what a dynamic system it is. And as these generalist, opportunistic, or let's just say generalist predators, it's really important, and this is a message that we're really trying to emphasize to the state government and others that do marine spatial planning and protection of the area, is that you can't just develop a management system that you set and then say, well, this is how it's going to be for the next 20 years. Because it's such a variable system, even in the 2 years of our study. So having a responsive management plan and one that accommodates changing environmental conditions, changing prey abundance and so on is very important. And with regard to whether it's possible longer term, I suppose Andre is the best one to answer that question. But the study site that we have set there and the way bridges we have in place, I mean, they are there for the long term. So while we have human power and money to continue to collect the data, then yes, we can continue to do that. Yes, Andre. Oh, Kathy wanted to say something.
That's clapping hands, not.
Clapping. I thought that was hands
I meant
up
to put
saying,
my hand up, but I'll give you a clap anyway.
Okay.
But to the opposite, if you would have a completely different study system with where you would not have the facility, for instance, to weigh the birds at departure and coming back, how transferable is your approach to a completely different seabird colony? And I must say, you know, I don't really have the answer to that question. So it's more out of interest. You know, what part of your framework do you think is transferable to other systems?
Well, I guess that all of the elements can be transferable, but they do take initial setup. And so that's why it works really well for some of the penguin study sites around the world that have these weigh bridges in place. But there are also methods being used in terms of kind of camera trapping and camera work, seeing how much birds are bringing back in the bills, so turns and things like that. And I think that that kind of thing could be used to replace the mass. And the same with the diet. It does kind of need to be optimized a bit for the local fish species or whatever you're looking at. It works very well in the coarse scale, but if you're going to have, you kind of need voucher specimens to get the DNA from. But for us, that was already set up. And so for the south coast of Australia, that is already set up. So it's, yeah, in terms of for us, it's just piggybacking on the work we already do, because we already have people going to the field every week to weigh a lot of these birds. And so the collection of poo is just we just put a bit of cardboard, nail it down in front of the burrow overnight. So yeah, it works well for that. I don't know, that wouldn't work. That really works for burrow nesting birds, not so much the shuffling around in a colony penguins. But yeah, I really would like to see how it could be. I think if I was to, like, in an ideal world, I would kind of pick fisheries that I wanted to manage, or places that were really quite key at the time and that could be key long term, and look at that species and how something could be. I mean, if you break it down to just mass, effort and diet, then you can measure those in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, and there are ways also where you can involve members of the public. You mentioned the work on tern diet, pictures of people from the public are increasingly being used to work on tern diet. So that's probably a nice way to do it.
Yeah. While we're here, do we have any questions from the audience? I don't see anybody raising hands.
Great.
Oh yeah, Andre, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. No, just a bit of general comment. It's yeah. Thanks, David. David. That you know, to give the confidence for us to use this on fisheries, and just we actually, as we speak, we actually using those penguin sepia and trying to put in the ecosystem model the same they use for fisheries. Those models that, you know, the ecosystem model, like we use EcoPath in this case, and an EcoPath has a function to add the CPOA from the fisheries. So we are going to forget about the fisheries and let's put the penguin CPOA.
Okay.
Because of course you're right, because those fisheries, they use this really coarse data and they assume that they're really good quality, and they completely ignore the data that comes from natural predators. For example, fisheries, if you're super rich in a project, you probably do a sampling once a month in a couple of days. So as opposed to have penguins there, they go every day. They like a sampling machine collecting this on a daily basis. So they give by far much better data. Of course, I'm biased.
I think the nice thing culturally, if you're going the way of using EcoPath and this sort of models, is that the team behind EcoPath, and especially the team of Daniel Poli, they're very aware that metrics from seabirds can be used. So in opposite, I would say, to more conventional, traditional fisheries biology, these people, they are more likely to listen to you if you're speaking about a metric gathered by seabirds. So you might have allies there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. I think if we don't have any immediate burning questions from the audience, I reckon we should probably move on to the next paper, just for time's sake. Thank you very much, Catherine, Andre, Richard.
Well, nice to see you.
Nice to see you all. Jan, I know you're there and didn't say anything, but congratulations as well. No,
congratulations on the paper.
Yeah, really lovely little paper.
Thank you.
It was a very lovely read. So thank you very much for that. And all right, I think with that we'll start moving on to Socotron Cormorants, and we've got Sabir Muzaffar who's online at the moment. Hang on a second, let's unmute you. Hey, Sabir, how are you?
Very good, thank you very much.
It has been a long time, my friend. How have you been?
I've been fantastic.
Good, I'm glad to hear.
It sure has been a long time.
Yeah, it has, hasn't it? Since I was a snot-nosed undergrad at Memorial University.
The Newfoundland days, I can't forget them.
I bet. It's hard to forget a place like that.
Absolutely.
All right, David, I think you're doing this paper, so I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, and yeah, good day again, everyone. So the paper led by Sabir Muzaffar, who is a professor of ecology at the United Arab Emirates University, is on Socotron Cormorants in the Arabian Gulf, and it's actually a review. We picked this study because in Seabird Sessions, we like to hear about regions of the globe with a deficit in seabird knowledge. And this seems to be the case for the Arabian Gulf, despite the fact that about 20 seabird species breed there. And the second reason is that I must admit to my absolute fascination for the Socotron Cormorant, this dark animal which has to survive in the burning heat of the Gulf. So the lead author, Professor Muzaffar, has very wide-ranging interests, and I encourage you to check on his profile. These interests include forestry and also epidemiology beyond seabird biology. But across the last decade, he built a nice body of work on Socotron Cormorants, and the review we talk about today draws a lot from that suite of papers. Take a look at the paper. It's very much to the point and very clear. And in brief, the Socotran Cormorant has a range spanning from the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and south into the Gulf of Aden. And the birds are very coastal, shallow diving, and they engage in these massive groups of social foraging on small pelagic fish. Sabir Muzaffar and his colleagues know this because they tracked the cormorants. They GPS tracked them during the breeding season. And outside of the breeding season, they did a satellite tracking of the birds, showing that they remain, where those birds which breed in the Gulf stay in the Gulf during outside of the breeding season. And they track patterns of primary productivity, which most likely indicate high abundance of small pelagic fish. And guess what? Even though the Socotran Cormorants do not compete with fisheries, in the Gulf, everyone hates them and tells that they take all the fish out of the Arabian Gulf. Does this story sound familiar to you? It's kind of amazing to find this again and again.
Rings a bell, doesn't it?
Yes, yes. So these dark birds breed on coastal islands, and the incredible fact is that their chicks are white. So it's just the opposite to Cape gannets, where the adults are white and the chicks are dark and suffer massively from the heat. So the cormorants, again, are much smarter because in this case, in the burning heat of the Gulf, the chicks are white. It's quite spectacular. Check the pictures online. And on the coastal islands where they breed, the main threat is disturbance, simply by people not aware, that they're a sensitive species, that you can't walk around and disturb them. And there's still an issue with some of these breeding areas not being efficiently protected. And of course, in the Gulf, there's also the latent risk of oiling, which was probably historically a contribution to the decline of the populations of Socotran cormorants. Yet, despite this, the Socotran cormorant is still the most abundant seabird in the Arabian Gulf, and sometimes gathers in spectacular roosts. And I remember some years ago, a regional airline of the Gulf used a wall-size picture of such a roost for advertisement. I think it was in Abu Dhabi airport. But I don't think that the cormorants received any brownies for this, for being showed on large walls.
Definitely need royalties.
Yes. So, Sabir, congratulations on leading all these studies and producing this very nice synthesis. And I'm curious, and probably people listening will want to hear a little more about fisheries in the Gulf. Could you tell us a little more about fisheries and whether some of these fisheries do target the small pelagic fish the cormorants are feeding on?
So thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm very happy to be able to talk about this at this forum. And to talk about the fisheries, really, there's a little bit of a history here. As you know, the Arabian Gulf is famous for oil. So in the 60s or 50s, they started to discover oil, which led to massive development in most of the Gulf state countries. And this really started to fly upwards for the United Arab Emirates in the 80s. So even in the 80s, it was pretty low populations compared to what we have now. Right now, the United Arab Emirates has a population of roughly about 9 million people, of which only about 1 million or less is the original Emirati population. So this rapid expansion of population meant that a lot of people have arrived from different parts of the world. And this has been linked with changes in the fisheries practices. So historically, they hunted, some of the typical types of fish, including, things like what we call hamur, echinephalus, which is a grouper fish, and then a variety of barracuda, trevallies. These things are still fished and in relatively large quantities. The ministry typically keeps track of what is being landed, and there has been, of course, a gradual increase in that. In addition to that, there has been massive input of fish in the fisheries from outside the Arabian Gulf. So there's a lot of fishing going on in order to support the fish industry inside the Gulf, but it's outside in the coastal Omani waters. So, you know, a lot of these are mostly large fish. There is a little bit of a fishery for shark, and it's not so much the fin, the shark fin, but it's mostly a smaller variety of sharks. But you know, it's not so much in the tastes of everyone. It's more of a traditional fish that sometimes people eat. But there is a fishery. It's illegal to do certain types of fishing. So, for example, bottom trawls and you know, catching a certain amount of shark. You know, it's all managed to a great extent. With respect to the smaller forage fish, we really don't have a good estimate of what they're catching. So according to the ministry, it's not very much of a commercial species, but we know that it's used as a bait fish. And so, you know, there's a fair amount of capture of sardines, and there are quite a few species of them, and anchovies that are, you know, both inside and just outside of the Arabian Gulf. So it's gradually increasing, mostly to support the changing tastes of the demographic. And we're looking at, you know, certain species going downwards. So the typical commercial species, hamur or the groupers, and, you know, trevallies, other types of like barracuda, or, you know, some of the more trophy type of fish like sailfin, sawfish. Those are somewhat, you know, I should say they were shaky earlier, but they're more managed nowadays.
Mm. And the resources you're talking about, especially small pelagic fish and the cormorant foraging, seems to be highly coastal. But in terms of productivity, since the Gulf is very shallow overall, you mentioned that the maximum depth is in the range of 100 meters, even in the central part, if I remember well. You could also have high productivity right in the middle, and small pelagic fish and more pelagic feeding cormorants. A sort of setup which reminded me quite a lot of the Bay of Bengal as a highly productive system. So do you think that cormorants were always coastal, or that at some stage, you know, they were also foraging farther offshore and are maybe now more disturbed by marine traffic? Would that be an option, or do you think that they were highly coastal anyways, even historically?
That's a good question. I think my gut feeling is that they have been coastal historically. And again, that has to do with the oceanographic conditions within the Arabian Gulf. So the Arabian Gulf seems to be very monotonous. So it's very warm waters. And the coasts tend to receive some nutrients from the coastal zones, not so much from rivers, because we, at least within the United Arab Emirates, there are no major rivers coming out. But then there are branches coming off of Iraq and other more northern, some also in Iran, that add to the coastal, I should say, increase in productivity. But generally, if we take phytoplankton as an index, we notice that, first of all, there are some clear-cut differences. If you go inside the Arabian Gulf, it's straightforward lower productivity compared to just outside the Arabian Gulf. So there's a narrow strait there known as the Strait of Hormuz. And immediately outside of that, you see high levels of productivity. And throughout the Omani coastline on the outside, there's quite high productivity as a whole.
Yeah, I heard especially around around Socotron Island that the fish resources were still very abundant there.
Yes, and you know, not only that, but all the way from the mouth of the Arabian Gulf down to the Gulf of Aden, the coastal zones support a few hundred more species of fish. So compared to the inside. So it's a big difference in terms of species diversity as well. So the inside is quite poor in diversity and low in nutrients. Having said that, we see clear seasonal patterns. So phytoplankton throughout the year remains relatively low throughout the central portions of the Arabian Gulf. But there are periods in the, I should say, cycle where gradually the whole of the Arabian Gulf appears to be higher in phytoplankton compared to the rest of the year. Now it's still low phytoplankton, but if you were to follow some satellite imagery, we did a little bit of work before, which was published in Marine Ecology Progress series, where we tried to link the foraging patterns of Socotron cormorants with the phytoplankton, I should say the chlorophyll count. And what we found was during the breeding seasons, which is where our cormorants were located in the northern part of the Emirates, I should say, which is the eastern part of the Arabian Gulf. And there was high phytoplankton diversity, or I should say density, and it also was where they were foraging. And this was also the time when we think that the anchovies are moving from east to west, anchovies and sardines. So there were some patterns during the breeding season. But after breeding, when they started to move from our colony in the east towards the western part of their distribution, where they are amassing in large numbers in the roosts, we could not see that link because at that point it's summer and only the deeper waters seem to have temperatures that are bearable. The coastal waters are actually quite warm for things like phytoplankton. So you see a decline in the phytoplankton abundance, except in the very nearshore areas. So we are still kind of scratching our heads to figure out how this system works. But for sure, there are some patterns of differences in phytoplankton abundance throughout the year. And it seems like it rises in the winter time here, which is, the cold period of the winter is about 10 degrees on land, maybe for a few days, but most of the time it's 18 or 15 degrees. So it's kind of a nice time. And that's when we see these blooms of phytoplankton, particularly in some of the areas where they are breeding.
And since you were speaking about cormorants outside of the Gulf, what are the informations on population sizes for Socotron cormorants outside of the Gulf area?
I don't think they did a proper estimate anytime recently, but there's a guesstimate out there, which is something along the lines of 20,000 breeding pairs, which is located further south. There are some known islands, one of them being the Halaniyat Island complex, which consists of more than one island. And there seems to be more further down. Interestingly enough, the Socotra Island itself does not have very many breeding populations.
Yeah, it's a good quiz. It's a good quiz point. Huh? I avoided that mistake.
Yeah, it's just recently, maybe in the last 10 years, that they first detected some breeding, but they do roost there. So Socotra Island has maybe a few, less than 100, a couple of hundred maybe breeding pairs. But the bulk of them are further north from Socotra. But they do forage in the locality of Socotra Island and then into the Gulf of Aden.
And maybe a last question before I hand over to Grant. Do you think, because there seem to be fewer Socotron cormorants on the Iranian side of the Gulf, which I think in the review you explain with really strong disturbance and oiling historically. But do you think that there might be information about that part of the Gulf to which we do not have access at the moment?
It could be, but it's been a long while that they've known about the movements, at least anecdotally, of the Socotron Cormorants. Historic information suggests that they still go there, they roost there, but there's no information internationally about breeding there. And I'm not aware of any studies from the Iranian side regarding breeding sites. They do regularly seem to publish on their, coastal seabirds and other birds. So they do have materials out there, but there's no indication that there are breeding Socotron cormorants. But certainly there are roosting individuals that may go to those waters, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are numbers foraging there.
Yes, no, very interesting. Thank you. And Grant, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I sure do. Sabir, that's quite cool. It's one of these areas of the world that I don't think most of us appreciate as a relatively rich area with regards to seabirds, for sure. It's and Socotron cormorant, as David has pointed out, is such an interesting bird. So it's quite cool to see this review out, and thanks for all the cool work you've done over the years on these birds. I have two questions that are, I guess, probably somewhat related to the human aspect. You made a really interesting point, which I actually never really thought about until you had mentioned this, but because of the discovery of oil, and you've obviously the area has attracted people from all over the planet. Does that mean that not only is the fisheries ideology sort of changed because you've got people from various cultures, but has the conservation culture changed as well with that? Have people come in with varying degrees of understanding or respect for conservation, and has that shifted how people view the birds?
I think it's a bit of both. I think the United Arab Emirates, if you know anything about Dubai, there'll be all these things where they have to say we're the first in this, we've got the tallest building, the largest, whatever. And so it actually comes with a very competitive mindset. And so one of the good things has been that they have a sense of competition towards conservation as well. So right now they have 11% of the coastal habitats strictly protected, and it's really well protected. I've been to many of them, and you see not a single boat in those areas, and you see that they're being patrolled by only Coast Guard and relevant authorities. So there's a lot of progress going on. The issue with seabirds generally is also very favorable. So they want to see wildlife and birds. The historic cormorant hatred, I think, if we look at the laws in the 1980s, there was a law called the UAE hunting law, which strictly prohibited hunting of any kind of wildlife, including seabirds or mammals and so on. But it explicitly allowed the hunting of cormorants. But subsequently, it has been upgraded, and now it's illegal to hunt the cormorants as well, or even collect eggs, which was done at somewhat, I should say, in a very low-scale, traditional kind of way, perhaps in the 80s and 90s. Certainly there's one reported, there's one published paper on it from perhaps the late 90s, I think, if I'm not wrong. So they already have a strong conservation ethic. The issue is then, they tried to build very quickly, and you have to keep in mind that it's a relatively short, I should say, a young country. So it became its own nation in 1971, and really it started to pick up on development in the 80s. So it's been just a few years, a few decades, I should say. And during that time, there was all kinds of conflict in the region. So they managed to overcome all of that, and then still, move towards conservation of different species, including the cormorant. Unfortunately, Sinai Island is not yet protected, and I believe there is movement now, and especially after we put a lot of effort into trying to, communicate what we have learned, and it's helpful to know that perhaps 40 or 50% of the global population stays within the or is found within the Emirati waters, and so that really makes it urgent, and there is a move towards trying to protect them a lot better. And so we're optimistic that perhaps Sinai Island and other locations might be eventually protected.
That's really cool. And actually, you sort of touched a little bit on my next question, which was about the conflict in the region. Obviously, being a hotbed for the Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq in the 2000s. So, how has that had an impact on the birds in any way other than, say, noise disturbance?
Certainly, I think there are far bigger problems. I mean, even if we were to set aside areas that are well protected, I mean, oil pollution is a problem. It does occur in low, levels throughout the Gulf. If you remember in the older days, Francis Visa was doing all this work on oil. Chronic oil pollution, and we're quite certain that this happens every now and then, and it's just not well studied, so we don't know much. Plus, there is a chance of periodic illegal oil dumping, which the authorities are very strict about trying to control it, but it happens every now and then. And then, of course, the issue of plastic. This is a bigger one because it's a small kind of Gulf, and it's kind of the narrow mouth of the Gulf does not allow rapid turnover for the water. So you see all this water, it circulates in a kind of a clockwise way. And it takes a lot longer for the water to be replaced. And a lot of these pollutants tend to accumulate. And we're also seeing evidence of that in the other types of pollution which we don't see very much, and that's heavy metals. So our recent work is trying to focus on the diet of the cormorants and expanding into the greater marine environment by looking at fish. So we're looking aggressively, at least my lab is, to see heavy metal contamination in fish muscle. And for us, this is an ecosystem problem, but it also has a direct human impact because people will ultimately be eating the fish. So hopefully between those two things, we can move forward with trying to reduce the sorts of pollution that enter into the Gulf.
Yeah, super fascinating, Sabir. Yeah, the plastics thing. Yeah, obviously that would be a huge issue there. It must accumulate. Do we have any questions from the audience for Sabir before we're getting pretty close to the end? But if anyone has any questions, please speak up now or forever hold your peace. Oh, Andre is unmuted himself.
Oh yeah.
Hi, Andre. Go for it.
So, Grant, you thought our birds here eating a lot of fish. So I was very impressed to see how much fish is taking from the system there. It's pretty amazing. But I'm just going to take the lead from Davi and talk something controversial. It's that because we are seabird biologists, we have this impression that our birds can go there in the system and make a big dent on how much fish is there, because we just think about the seabird and the fish, but we are in this ecosystem that, in terms of biomass, we very, when I say we, I'm talking about seabirds, so very insignificant. So we have this almost like arrogant vision that seabirds can go there and make a dent on the food supply, but I don't think they can, because when you put this in a big picture in terms of biomass, they are very small players. So I just put there, David said you have to think bold, which I agree 100%, 110%, but we also have to put ourselves in perspective. Otherwise, we just think about seabirds and fish. We're part of a much larger system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I guess and this is obviously relevant to the cormorant issue here, because the concern is that these birds are eating all of this fish, but and you certainly see in North America, the double-crested cormorant is a big issue up there, and people argue that they're eating the fish, but these birds have been in balance with the ecosystem for a long period of time. It's only since we've come along that that the real impacts on the ecosystem have been apparent. So yeah, I totally get your point there, Andre. It's yeah, the birds.
If I may jump in,
yeah,
it's always a tricky matter for us to address these questions, especially to the general audience or even to the ministries. So there is that urgent need to think what is competing with the fishery, and of course it's the seabirds, so we need to do something about it. But I think our narrative has been that in terms of biomass, exactly what you mentioned, that it's a little dent. I was very nervous writing the paper which we published earlier about where we tried to estimate rather crudely the biomass of fish that was being eaten. And we were trying to argue exactly that it's a relatively small quantity compared to what is being taken by humans, for example. But sometimes it's kind of challenging to place that as a question. But largely we have been quite, I should say, lucky in terms of the ears that are listening to us. So it takes time for sure to build an understanding of what is needed. But I mean, just to give you a sense, a couple of years ago we started work with WWF, which has I should say, a presence here in the UAE, and they were trying to see whether further areas could be protected. And so what they did was they went around looking for anyone who's studying anything in an academic or kind of research setting. And so they came to me to see what I could provide. And so I said, well, here's all my seabird data. All the data that we'd already published, I handed it over to them, raw data. And what they did was they took data from everyone, as well as anecdotal information, and did some sort of a modeling analysis, Markson modeling, for those who are familiar with that. So it takes not only hardcore data, but all types of data, even if it's anecdotal data. And then it builds a model to show where are the good spots. And at that point in time, the ministry suddenly realized this could be good. And so they supported this initiative. And in the end, what happened was they mapped most of the northern Emirates. So there's 7 Emirates. Dubai and Abu Dhabi are the most familiar ones. The rest of them are smaller, but they have significant biodiversity, including my blessed community of Socotron Cormorants, which is the largest in the UAE. So we kind of put all those bits of information, and as a result, we now have a very detailed map of where the resources are, the biodiversity is, and what is a good thing to do. So we're very, very optimistic that this will now be used, notwithstanding what they need for fish and fisheries. So there's this conservation ethic there. It's just a matter of placing it properly with the authorities and then working for a relatively long period of time to get things done.
But Sabir, that's a very interesting point. Just to follow up on that, when you put all the natural consumers together, there's very little room for humans to go there and take out. I think that's, even though you think your birds, the consumption is minute, there's all other natural consumers that they're taking a fair chunk, which leaves not many room for fisheries.
My attitude towards that is humans need to hold back a little. There are other creatures on Earth. And, if you look at global fisheries, 100 million tons annually, that's the legal number. But everything else is, if you were to add everything up, human would be very far up there. And of course, we've managed to make things extinct, which seabirds don't usually do by feeding activities, or the other species for that matter.
Yeah.
So, you know, unless it's something that was introduced by humans, which is a different story.
Yeah.
So, you know, I see your point. I mean, it's something that we all need to work on. You know, we need to think about what other species exist. I mean, it's not just for us.
Yeah. Jan, I think we've got one comment or question here from Jan. He's just raised his hand and turned his camera on. That's shocking. But I think after that we'll call it quits because we're getting short on time. So Jan, if you want to, I tried to unmute you. Let's see if that works. There you go. You're on, Jan. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Sabir, for very interesting review. I was wondering, you know, coming back on Richard's comment about the ecosystem in Phillip Island, how dynamic is your system there? Like you said, we were able to identify, well, we, not the seabirds, some people were able to identify with models where the important zones are. But are they really dynamic? And do you think there is a way of managing very dynamic zones?
That's a very good question. I don't think I have a good answer for that. It seems like there is, you know, the pattern, for example, if you go with phytoplankton, we know that it's more stable than dynamic in my mind. It goes through these phases where you see blooms, and then there are phases where there's low productivity. And then what's very interesting is that colleagues from the Omani side have done some work, and also within the UAE, and the Greater Gulf, that there are these frontal zones that kind of divides the Arabian Gulf into 3 broad segments. And you see distinct phytoplankton communities in these segments. So if you were to collect water, regardless of which time of the year it is, you may be able to see patterns that are characteristic of these segments in which they are divided. And within those segments, things tend to stay relatively stable, but, you know, slowly fluctuating if you like. There are highs and lows, but not huge highs and lows. Having said that, we've had incidences of, I should say outbreaks, if you want to call it that, of jellyfish, so sudden abundance of jellyfish, which is regarded as a problem. But again, nobody's studying this system in the long term. Similarly, there are these red tides that we see. Huge areas may be red briefly because of the abundance of certain species of phytoplankton. And again, some of them are harmful, so there's a great deal of concern about it. But possibly that's triggered by, again, this is speculation, but with some circumstantial evidence, possibly triggered by high levels of input of nutrients from anthropogenic sources. It's not a very natural phenomenon anyway, but so there's elements of these spikes of things going on. With respect to other bigger fauna, we have the second largest population of dugong in the world, which migrates, but some of them appear to be not that migratory, but certainly they seem to leave the Gulf and they venture out into the Greater Arabian Sea. I think it's second only to the population in and around Australian waters. And we also have dolphins, of which we know very little, except what species are there. And there seems to be some species that are more common, like the, I forget, I think it's one of the bottlenose types. You know, we see patterns of species abundance, and it's not like completely catastrophic where you see total absence of something every now and then.
Super, super, super interesting. Thanks for that, Sabir. That was a fascinating discussion. I've learned more about the Arabian Gulf than I think I have in my entire life today.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
I think with that we'll probably call it a day. It's 9:15 my time, and if I don't go in and battle toddlers with my wife, I'll probably get punched in the face. So nice to see you all, and thank you very, very much again, Kathy, Sabir, for your papers. Yeah, please feel free to join us again sometime in the future. We're doing these every week. Next week we are at 1600 GMT, so we're back to the North American / Eurasian or European time slot, and I have a couple more papers for you. I think with that, we'll let you all go. Thank you very much again, and David, as usual, nice to see you. Welcome back, and we'll
Yes, it was very nice. Thank you.
We'll see you all.
Thank you very much. Thanks all.
Bye, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye, Kathy.